Today on the Beginner Photography Podcast.
In my career, the most important thing was seeing moments that I had missed. It wasn't capturing the moments, although that was the end goal. Because when I started as a photographer, I just would walk out and of a assignment going, I didn't really see anything there.
Yeah.
But then after I'd missed them over and over and over and over again, then I started to say, okay, now at least I saw them in retrospect. And then I started to anticipate, because that's what's required as photographers. You've got to be able to tell the future, or at least predict that something's important is going to happen in the future.
Well, welcome back, photo friend. Today we are interviewing Craig Strong. Craig Strong is the inventor of the Lensbaby lens system. Now, if you're not familiar with the Lensbaby lens system yet, you are in for a treat. Now, a few months ago, I interviewed Magda Stolte in a community spotlight interview, and we talked a good deal about Lensbaby and how they have unlocked a whole new world of creativity for her. So, again, if you're interested, be sure to check out that interview after this one today with Craig. But today, Craig shares his story on how he came up with the idea of Lensbaby while he was a working wedding photographer. And, really, I think this interview is a lot about pushing through those fears of the unknown. If you feel strong enough about an outcome, then, you should do it. Like, how to kind of follow that instinct. So, if you're feeling that, I know that you're really going to enjoy this interview right here. But first, you know what time it is. I really want to say thank you to Vic for leaving the podcast a 5-star iTunes rating and review. Vic says, I've been searching for a photography podcast for what seems like years. I'm not a beginner, but I think this podcast is informative and so wonderful to listen to for photographers at all stages. Keep doing what you're doing. Man, thank you, Vic. I really appreciate that. As long as someone out there is still getting value from this podcast, I sure will keep it up. While I selfishly love these conversations with amazing photographers that I get to have, I truly equally love sharing these interviews with you because, well, we're all different. We all hear something through our level of experience, right? And then we interpret those things differently, and then we try different things with our own photography based on what it is that we hear and we think that we understood, if that makes sense. And anyway, I get to see what it is that you create, when you post images in the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook community, and every single time I'm truly just amazed. So again, Vic, thank you so much. Now, if you haven't left the podcast a rating and review, but you're enjoying the show, well, what are you waiting for? It is a great way to help support the show. And if you are listening on Spotify, guess what? Great news for you. You, too, can now leave the podcast a 5-star rating right on the podcast's show page in your Spotify app. So thank you for all of your support. With that, let's go ahead and get on into today's podcast with Craig Strong. Craig, I know that, when I think of Lensbaby, I think of kind of off the wall. I think unique. I think innovative. I also think maybe a little experimental. Are those the same words that you would use to describe your earliest days in photography?
That's a great question, Raymond. Um, I would say that my early days in photography were all about the learning of the technical, all about it wasn't artistic. It was just purely, I was fascinated with what this gear could do. A friend of mine in 7th grade, Holly Love, had a project. Her project was on SLR cameras, and I was just fascinated by how things worked. My dad was a mechanical engineer, and the fact that we have this mirror that apparently is instantly getting out of the way of the film, and then different kinds of shutters that move out of the way of to change the shutter speed, or doing things at different speeds. That was just super fascinating. Another friend of mine brought a little view, like a Leica type camera. I think it was an Agfa, little rangefinder camera, and it had this split image that went through, and I was super fascinated with that. And so for me, it was really on the end of the gear, and experimental, absolutely not. Like I was just like, from the get-go saying, hey, I want to know how this works. And then it wasn't until I learned the way the gear worked that I started saying, well, I kind of want to be a photographer now because this is so neat. My dad was a mechanical engineer, and so I think that kind of DNA for me was where the photography bug started. And I think of all these 60 some year old men who are buying gear, and they've never really become photographers, and they're super proud of all these amazing pieces of gear they have. But for me, I got over that real early. And but that was the initial thing that invited me in. Yeah, it wasn't until years later that I would say there was experimental would be a descriptor.
So the technical side is what drew you in. How long was it that you maybe not experimented, that you studied those cameras and got used to those before the idea of photography as maybe a profession, or the art of image making became as important to you?
Yeah, I would say that happened pretty much the moment I stepped into a dark room, and that wasn't until college. My freshman year in college, I was going to school in Los Angeles, and I went out for the track team, and it was so hot. And like I remember there was a day, I think it was 105 degrees, and we had to run sprints around the track and 6-minute miles. We had to do 2 6-minute miles, and I saw my dorm, and I just kept running straight. I was just like, I'm done. And I never went back to track again. And I'm like, okay, well, what do I do now? I don't want to just be here for academics. Let's figure this out. I love photography. I went to the student union building, and the photography, there was a need for a photographer, or staff photographer. And so I had never stepped foot in a darkroom. And once I did, I was like, oh, this is magic. And that magic of watching the images come up into in the developer, and all of this, it was just like it was something so amazing for me that, again, like, we're back on the technical side, but at this point I was a good photographer. They gave me a bulk loaded roll of 10 frames of Tri-X to go shoot as my interview. And I spent like every minute, like they said, have it to us by, I don't know, 8 o'clock tonight or 5 o'clock tonight. And I spent every minute going and framing and doing all these images. And I think that might have been the best 10 images I shot during college, at least certainly my freshman year. And so I was an accomplished photographer at this point, but it really hadn't become part of uh, like a real sense of compelling identity. This is what I have to do, until that moment. And then there was just no choice once I'd seen what was possible in the dark room. But this was my path.
Why do you think those 10 frames were your best?
I think they were my best because I spent time really deciding, what is it that I see here, and went seeking things that were important to me. Um, I was brand new on campus. I didn't know this place. I didn't know the people that much, but there was a friend of mine from high school who'd gone down to LA the year before. So I sought out her. That was the one people shot, like, posed portrait that I did of her and her roommates. And there was this incredibly ugly fountain. Like, it literally looked like, and people would refer to it as elephant poop. And um, And there's a huge story behind it too. It was super controversial because the art department was never um, consulted in the construction of this. They just handed over the physical plant and said, "Here's a bunch of lava stones. Make a fountain."
Wow.
And so, but apparently, I made the best photo of that fountain that had ever been made. I didn't know that it was supposed to be ugly. And so I think both having that new perspective and saying, okay, what is it? What is it that I see? And really pondering um, you know, something that is part of my vision. And that may be one of the first times that I was super purposeful rather than just going out and seeing, what do I find? What do I see? What's going on here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So before we get into your college career as working for was it the paper or it was for the school, right?
Yeah, it was for student publications, so the newspaper
Okay.
and the yearbook.
Gotcha. So before we get into that, I want to know a little bit more about the learning process for you in photography because today, I think it's probably easier than ever to learn photography today,
Yeah.
just because you do get that instant feedback. But I'm always interested in those earliest days for all photographers. So when it came time for you to actually learn photography, what was the hardest part for you to grasp, for you to understand from a technical standpoint?
Well, I'm going to go back to the gear because that initial fascination um, was followed by gear that failed me or that I just didn't know how to use. And so the my vision was never that great, but I could squint and get 20/20, without my glasses.
Same, yeah.
And so I never knew I needed glasses. And so shooting through, I think I had a, early 70s, late 60s Mamiya TL or 500 TL SLR with a 50 millimeter 1.7 lens on it. And or maybe it was a 2.0 lens, but I, I would rely on the little diamond pattern thing and the split image, and sometimes like my eyes just didn't pick up what was going on fast enough, so they were way out of focus. So that was a problem because everything obviously was manual focus, and and then I was so fascinated with the gear and thought it was so neat that I went after that camera died in a rainstorm because it was at the bottom of my tent and all the water
Oh
just
no.
ended up in my bag with my camera. Um, I went and got an old Nikon F with what is purported to be to this day the worst zoom lens ever made, a 43 to 86 millimeter. I think it was a 3.5 to 5.6. And you just couldn't focus that, period. And it had a shutter that was slow or a mirror that was slow getting up. So I could only photograph at shutter speeds of I think a tenth of a second and longer. Um,
What?
so, which I got around. I actually started making some really cool images with it because I found myself on a trip right after I discovered that, oh, wow, I've got this diagonal vignette going through one corner of my image. And so, but it only happens on stuff, or it didn't happen on this one long exposure. So maybe I can take long exposure. So I ended up on this trip to Canada with a bunch of friends. And I remember being on a ferry and taking this long exposure of a friend pretending he's hanging onto a post, pretending like he's being blown by the wind. And I'm shooting a half-second exposure, and it turned out great. And so for me, like, it was kind of a circuitous route to go, hey, I don't have to do this with a 60th of a second or faster. I can do different things and they come out kind of cool.
Wow, that's funny to think about. So I, this is gonna sound ridiculous. I had a friend who, growing up, who had a broken arm, and he would pitch in baseball, and he had to learn how to pitch like with a. It didn't like heal back correctly, like it wasn't straight, so he kind of had to bend to his arm, and he had to learn with essentially broken equipment, and the way that he works, like I think still to this day, is now entirely different than anybody else. So do you think that you working with a broken camera there essentially in the beginning still changes how you shoot, or affects how you shoot today?
I think it opened my mind up to the fact that there's solutions to problems that you didn't expect. And so when I experience a problem in the field, I'm immediately thinking, or about Lens Baby products or whatever, I'm immediately thinking, what's the fastest way to fix this? Because as a photojournalist, because that's what I worked as a full-time photojournalist from the time I, well, left college for sure, but clear through college, I worked as a photojournalist. And then for 10 years after, um, continued that full time. And if I'm in a situation where my gear breaks, I still have to come back to the newspaper with a shot. Like there's just no other option. And I can only think of one situation where I wasn't able to do that, and that was the film, the back of my camera, the little latch broke
Oh,
on uh, an F100 Nikon body, and I didn't have a backup body, and so I've never gone to a shoot since without a backup body. um, and and so I do think it made me more of a problem solver to say, oh, there's another way to do this that may not be obvious now that the regular way is taken away.
of course. Yeah, I think that it's a very important skill set to have,
Yeah.
especially in a fast-paced environment such as photojournalism. So you went out, you did your interview, so to say, of the your 10 frames. You come back, you show the images, you get the job, obviously. What do you have to learn at this point? Because now are being thrown into a world of being able to having to tell stories with a camera rather than just taking snapshots. Is that right?
Right, right. And it's a pretty forgiving environment, I think, a student newspaper. You're not expected to you're not going to get fired. You're I think I was making less than $6 every 2 weeks. Like that was, there wasn't much of a budget, and I was on the bottom of the totem pole. Um, and so for me, what I needed to learn was to be proactive in getting names from people that I photographed. And yeah, I'm new on campus. I don't know these people, and most of them are upper class people, and they know the place and are intimidating. And I was fairly introverted and not super secure about myself as a person or as a photographer. So I think getting over those hurdles of doing people photography and then needing to get the names for the captions, that was a huge one for me. I know that street photographers have to get over that, and or they just have to be so incognito that nobody ever notices it. But for me, that wasn't really an option. As a photojournalist later, I had to come to grips with the fact that I'm on scenes that people don't want me there. It could be an accident, could be a fire, could be a robbery, who knows what it is. And so I've got to deal with police. I've got to deal with a situation that may be in crisis while I'm photographing it. And that, you know, those were important skills to take baby steps toward when I was in college, to just go, hey, we all go to the same school. This person's not going to punch me in the face. Um, but I still have to get over this barrier that I had of talking to a stranger.
Yeah, I think I had a obviously I was never in a situation of crisis, I guess, but I think some of my first weddings it was like that. Like I was scared to say talk to the parents or ask them a question. And now thinking back, it's like, why would I be scared? Like, what are they gonna do? And like they want better photos. So, as far as like from an image perspective side, right now, what became most important to you? Because before, if we're just taking snapshots, friends, family, just things around the house, now being put in a situation where like a photo has to tell exactly what's going on. Was there a steep learning curve there for you, or did that come pretty naturally?
I would say that sports photography was probably the best teacher for me, because I had played sports. I'd played baseball and basketball, and I was playing volleyball at the time, intramural. And so for me, there was a certain understanding that I went in with, and yet at the same time, as a photographer, I'd never photographed these moments. Like I knew after the fact that, oh, this happened, but what was the still image that would have summed that up that somebody could look at after the fact and say, oh, this is an accurate representation, or this is the key moment in that buzzer beater shot, or, does it happen before the shot? Does it happen during the action of the shot? Does it happen when it's going into the basket? Is it the reaction of everybody afterwards? Like those kind of, uh, uh, you know, I would say sports is very similar to weddings, where there are so many important moments that are happening throughout that day and throughout that game that there's something right behind it. If I go out and I walk around my neighborhood, I might see a beautiful scene, I might not. I might see a moment happen between a couple of dogs or owners or people walking on the sidewalk, I might not. I might, it's a crapshoot. And so if I'm shooting something like you think about the emotions that go into sports. Like there are moments that take on monumental weight and importance to the people that are a part of this and the people that are watching. And so these are important moments. And I think that was really good for me to hone those skills. One, to be able to say, okay, I know this, like I had some point of reference. And two, to be able to go in and game after game after game say, I am coming away with nothing. And even though this is something I'm familiar with, these images don't tell the story. And so that frustration was a big part of it. And eventually I started capturing those moments. Eventually I started realizing that, okay, there's something that I can anticipate here that I know is about to happen, and be ready for that.
So did that just come through just you being at more games, or does that come from you looking at your images and reflecting and auditing your work after every assignment?
Well, I think the nature of working in newspapers, working at a school paper, working in the student publications is that you've got to document everything. And I do think that putting yourself in any situation, whether it's photography or work or like community that you want to build, having those regular accountabilities to say, oh, I've committed to this because I've got this role or this job, or I'm meeting with this community because I've named myself as a member, or whatever it is, that you start that ball rolling and you make that commitment, especially to other people. If I don't shoot those games, then I don't keep my job. Then that just continues the cycle to say, okay, well, I'm going to the soccer games now, I'm going to the baseball games now, and now we've got water polo season, and we've got this and we got that and the other thing. And so all of this, those deadlines ended up creating the, hey, my name's going to be under this picture. And so as I went to more and more games, and I started to connect with, hey, these moments are unfolding, I actually have seen them happen 1,000 times now, I might actually capture one. That would be the other thing that I'd say, is that in my career, the most important thing was seeing moments that I had missed. It wasn't capturing the moments, although that was the end goal. Because when I started as a photographer, I just would walk out and of a assignment going, I didn't really see anything there.
Yeah.
But then after I'd missed them over and over and over and over again, then I started to say, okay, now at least I saw them in retrospect. And then I started to anticipate, because that's what's required as photographers. You've got to be able to tell the future, or at least predict that something's important is going to happen in the future.
Hey, Raymond here, and we will get back to the show in just a moment. Let me ask you, were you happy with your photos when you were just taking snapshots with your phone or a point-and-shoot camera? Of course not. You wanted to unleash your creativity and capture the world with your unique vision. That's why you bought a DSLR. My free ebook, 46 Free Creative Photography Ideas, is built on that premise of taking ordinary ideas and using your creativity to make something uniquely your own. That ability to think outside of the box is what makes world-class photographers so successful. It's not their camera gear or their fancy lenses, but it's their ability to come up with a creative idea and execute. So download your free copy of 46 Creative Photo Ideas now by heading over to creativeimageIdeas.com. That is creativeimageIdeas.com. Now, let's go ahead and get back on into today's interview. Yeah, I can imagine having that skill or seeing that in yourself develop is probably something that is I don't know what the word is here, but like it really feels good, right? It feels like you're making progress in this field here. So at what point, because you didn't take this job until you were already in college, and then when you graduated, you continued with photojournalism. At what point did photography for you become so important that you thought to yourself, whatever reason I came to college, I don't know what your major was before, but like I'm gonna abandon that and I'm just gonna go full steam into photography? Was it a certain assignment? Was it a certain photo that you took? What was the catalyst for you?
I had worked at daily newspapers as an intern in the LA area. I'd worked at the Whittier Daily News. I guess the La Mirada paper was a weekly, but I was published there as well. I'd gotten published in the LA Times and Associated Press, and I don't know where those initial images ended up. I didn't even know to ask at the time. And so for me, I had gained this passion and this love for photography, and I tend to obsess about things. Like when I was on the gear kick in late junior high and high school, I would get a Shutterbug magazine. I would get an outdoor photographer magazine. I would get a popular photography magazine. Seems like there was one other one, and every single one I would read word for word, beginning to end, all the ads, all of the classifieds in the back, because there'd be little ads for like Stoffen Omni Bounce, and I wouldn't have any idea what most of these words meant. Like it was for me, I was laying the puzzle out on the table to go, okay, this is all part of photography. I don't understand how it all fits together. But that obsession then went, by the time I got to college, went to, how do I become a great photographer? How do I walk into a scene and be confident that I'm going to see a moment, I'm going to anticipate moments, not just miss them all, and walk away with something that's important to me. And having done that for 4.5 years, when my job fell through, because I had studied anthropology, I'd planned on going into overseas nonprofit work, and it was not until 1991, when there was no money in the organization that had offered me a job, and they said, yeah, you should probably look for another job, and because we can't hire you for 6 months. And I said, so I've got a job in 6 months? They're like, no. And at that point, the weight of the world lifted off my shoulders, because I had planned on going in this field for pretty much my entire college career, or most of it. And I went, oh, I can be a photographer. And that was really the first time that I considered, and this is just 2 months before graduating from college. And it was the first time that I considered, hey, this could be something that I could make a lifetime out of.
Wow. So at that point, you start putting in the resumes. You're like, this is where I want to work. This is
Yep.
what I want to do. So you were a photojournalist for how many years? Because I know that you transitioned into weddings at one point as well later on.
So I spent 2.5 years at a weekly newspaper here in Portland. I had interviewed with the photographer, and there's only one photographer for 5 newspapers, I guess.
Wow.
And so obviously he wasn't going to give me his job, but they let him go, I don't know, a month later, and came across my resume in his top drawer, and brought me in as a lab tech. So I'm only 20 hours a week, getting $6 an hour. as a lab tech, I've got college debt. I've got to pay my rent. And I negotiated uh, a situation where I got $5 per photo if I took photos as assignments, because I knew that was going to happen because Vern was gone and he was shooting everything for 5 newspapers. And now I'm a lab tech, and all the non-photographer writers, which there were about 8 of, they're the photographers. So I kind of saw the writing on the wall that this is going to turn into um, a full-time gig for me. And so that $5 per photo ended up being probably taking me up to $8 or $10 an hour, which was enough for me to live on, which was
Mhm.
great. So for 2.5 years, I was there at that group of weekly papers. Um, I, yeah, through kind of a humorous set of circumstances where they had cut my pay, taken the $5 per photo away, and told me this is an opportunity for you to go do freelance. And so, I'm in Portland. I start freelancing for the Oregonian 2 days a week, making more than I was making 5 days a week for them. And pretty soon I overlap into one of those 5 newspapers regions, and they say, well, you can't shoot for the Oregonian in our area. I'm like, this is a small town. Are you kidding
Wow.
me? What kind of opportunity were you offering me when you cut my pay and took away the stipend? And so that after that 2.5 years, because at that point I gave my notice, and immediately took one of the most powerful images, like 2 days later after I gave notice, probably the most powerful image I've ever taken in my life. Um, and on a shoot that I never would have taken had I not just given notice. So that led to working freelance for newspapers. Tanya Harding, within a couple months, did her thing at the Olympics, or the prep up to the Olympics, and all of a sudden Portland was just inundated with photojournalists, and all these agencies were needing photojournalists to follow her around. So I staked out Tanya Harding for a couple months, and which was just abhorrent. It was horrible. Like, she lived like 3 miles, 2 miles from my apartment. She lived in nearly as dilapidated apartment as I did, and so I would go sit out there and shoot the breeze with all these photographers from all over the US. And so I got connected with all of these agencies that over the course of the next couple years, those photos that I took of Tanya really paved the way for me to be able to pay my bills while I went full-time freelance. I also had to take a night job. I was working at a grocery store that I'd worked at in high school from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, stocking shelves, and then doing freelance work during the day for magazines and the agencies that I'd gotten connected with through Tanya. So that was how it all started. But I am super grateful for my editors and other photographers at the Oregonian, because they ended up funneling a ton of work my way for Sports Illustrated, for all these agencies, for New York Times. And without their mentorship and without their help, I would not have been able to have a career.
That's fascinating. That's fast. So then, at what point? Because it sounds like things are starting to pick up for you, starting to go pretty good. At
Yep.
what point do you transition into weddings?
So I was talked into my first wedding in,
We all are. We all were.
yeah, in I think the end of 93, because I'd gone freelance October of 93. uh, Leslie, who had been a writer at the newspaper and had gone freelance just a couple months before I left, she called me and asked me to shoot her wedding. And I said, yeah, I don't shoot weddings. I shot a wedding for a professor in college, and it was just an absolute nightmare. And she was pleased, but I just, it's just too much pressure. And
Yeah.
and I'm sure that was one of my most nightmarish prep times, because the first dozen weddings that I shot, I did not sleep through the night. I still, when the occasional wedding that I shoot, which is generally shotgun weddings for family, but I've got a very large family. Um, but the those weddings that I'm shooting now, or, it's been 3 or 4 years, I will have dreams the night before where, I forgot my pants, or, there's no film in the camera, or, something horrible goes wrong. So they're
Sure.
quite stressful. But regardless, Leslie asked me to shoot her wedding. I told her no. She called me back again. She said, please. I said, no. I don't shoot weddings. And the third time, she didn't even let me talk. She just said, Craig, we're not going to tell you what film to shoot. We're not going to tell you what pictures to take. We just want you to shoot the way you shoot for the newspaper. And, that was one of the most flattering things a photojournalist could hear. And so how do I say no to that?
Yeah.
And Leslie was a friend of mine. So I said, okay, I'll shoot your wedding. And, and I didn't believe her. I believed that there was going to be a mother-in-law that would come take me by the elbow and tell me to do this and shoot that, and don't do this and don't eat that and don't touch this, and go stand in the corner. But none of that happened. Apparently she had a stern talking to with her parents
Family.
and her
Yeah.
in-laws. And so that's where it went. And from then on, and that was one of the best photo essays I'd ever shot, because here I am working for a newspaper where I might have a half hour. I might be able to come back 3 times over the course of a month and shoot the same thing and do it a little bit better, or fill in the story before my editor says we have to publish this. It was always me holding back, going, I'm not quite ready with this, if it was a multi-day shoot, which very rarely happened.
Mhm.
But that was part of the problem, was they never had a beginning, a middle, and an end that could be defined, except for we had to go to press with this. And so I would say that that wedding for me was like, oh, this is a full story. And it all happened in like 4 hours. I
Mhm.
can't even believe that. That was a smorgasbord of candy for me as a photographer, to just go, oh my gosh, this all happens. I can tell a story. All of these moments are happening. And if I miss a moment, there's going to be a moment right behind and right behind and right behind. So I don't need to worry about that. And so I started showing that wedding only, and no setup shots, no portraits, no anything that could be construed as this guy's going to do, even though he's only showing us mainly black and whites or storytelling images. He's still going to shoot, an hour and a half of formals for me. Like, there was just nothing. I'm not showing you a single portrait. I'm going to show you exactly what I want to shoot, and that's what I ended up getting, and it was the best decision I made in my career, because I absolutely loved the 90% of the weddings that I shot, because they were, I got those weddings by showing work that I loved.
Wow. Oh gosh, that is such a great story. So many times I hear from other photographers that, when they get asked to shoot a wedding or something like that, they just go straight to Pinterest and look for inspiration. But you went the opposite way, obviously, because there was no Pinterest at the time, but just relying on those skills that you have to be able to capture it in a way that was unique to you and the story as you saw it, and to show it to other people. And then obviously you got clients because that's what you showed, because of what you did. That's fantastic. So then at what point I'm trying to figure out here, where did Lens Baby come along, right? Because to this point, when I think of photojournalism, I think straight photography, purist photography, capture the whole thing, the whole story in an image. And when I think of Lens Baby, as I said earlier, there's a uniqueness, there's an off the wall feel to it. It's very experimental. It's, let's try something new here. So where's that turning point for you?
So got I hit the 80-20 rule. 80-20 rule means that you put 20% of the effort into getting 80% efficient, or
Hmm.
proficient at something, um, and then it takes the other 80% to become an expert, or to become like absolutely unconsciously capable of, like, not having to think about what you're doing to do it well. And so I want to be, and I've heard this said on podcasts, a podcast before, I want to be consciously proficient at what I'm doing. And then I want to move on and become consciously proficient at something else, which means I have to be super disciplined, and I have to be, which is not something that I am naturally. So That said, I got really good at anticipating and capturing moment. And I think I got past that 80% toward being an expert at photojournalism. But I saw the people around me. I had a studio mate who was doing work with Diana, a plastic medium format camera, um, cross-processing her images. I did not have an art background. I took a few photography classes in college, but it wasn't enough to be a minor in communications. It was just like, hey, this is more of the same of what I was doing for the newspapers and that kind of thing. So I wasn't really challenged to look outside of what was right in front of me in terms of what was artistic until I was sharing a studio with about a dozen other photographers, a huge studio. It was really an amazing space. We had 4 or 5 large enlargers. We had these 20 by 30 trays full of chemicals, so we could go in and print anything that we wanted. It was amazing. But Krista was shooting with this Diana camera, cross processing, which I had no idea what that was, and putting up these images that technically were garbage. I mean, like there was nothing about them other than composition that worked. I mean, and the subject matter. So, I mean, she was skilled at photographing important subject matter, capturing moments. But then you get into the technical aspects. It's not in focus. It's the cross processing screwed up all the colors. Um, it was technically very imperfect, and yet I would stand in front of them and have this emotional, visceral response to what was going on in this scene, partly because I had this conflict of how can I love this image so much? How can I be impacted by this image so much? And it is so exactly the opposite of what I was doing. And so that really planted the seed for me to say, okay, I, I've got some things to learn about visual expression and how to match a subject matter, because that's the other thing. These images were more powerful because of the way they were shot than had they been shot with a straight lens and had
Wow.
they been shot with corner to corner sharpness. And so that was the beginning for me of exploring, okay, what's next for me if I have that opportunity to explore a more artistic approach than just a fly on the wall approach.
So what was it? What was next for you? Like what got you to dip your toes into that?
Well, it was a couple years later that I bought my first digital camera, and that was in 2000. End of 2000, I got a Canon D30, and 2 days later, I was in New York City meeting with my agency and showing my portfolio around. And I only took that digital camera, and I took a 28 millimeter 1.8 Canon lens. And all of a sudden that was now a 45 millimeter lens because of the 1.6x crop. And I was like, well, I didn't count on that. Like, I did not read that memo. And so I was like, okay, I've been thinking about doing something a little different. Maybe I can just, the trip, I think we price lined it for $125 a ticket or something for round trip tickets back when Priceline was just starting out and things could be, you can put
Super
a bid
cheap.
in and super, super cheap. So
Yeah.
off we went to New York, my wife and I ended up on Times Square outside of at the time, there were these camera stores. There's still a few of them that were just massive, and they had, all the normal stuff, usually way overpriced. But I just went straight to the video converters. So I went and I found this 0.42x converter, put it on the front of my 28 millimeter lens. It turned it into probably the equivalent of a 15, 16 millimeter fisheye, corner to corner, as far as the field of view goes. And it had bent lines, and I had played with fisheye in college. So I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. But they wanted like $400 for it. And it was, I was like, well, I'm not paying that. So I found myself at another camera store, and I walked in and they had $200 on it. I said, I'll give you $90 and I don't want to pay tax. And they're like, okay. So they jumped at it. And then I screwed that on the front of my 28 millimeter lens and just started playing. And the aspects of that were at the 1.8 wide open. The center was sharp, had shallow depth of field because I'm the native lens is at 1.8, but I could focus literally inside of that converter. So something touching the
Wow.
front of the lens, I could focus on. And so all of a sudden I had a brush in my hand that allowed me to paint a different palette, to paint different strokes on my canvas. And it was just fun. You know, I didn't spend any money on the trip. We price lined the tickets. We price lined the hotel. We're like, hey, we got money to spend. I've got an extra $90. Here we go. And so that was really the start for me of, hey, here's something that has a completely different way of seeing the world, and what can I see through it?
Yeah. Oh my god. So obviously today, Lens Baby makes a whole assortment of lenses. So I'm assuming that this was the catalyst for you to figure out, like, wait, how can I do more with this? What can I do? What can I change? And I know that there's a long history of Lens Baby, as you said. You know, you picked up that lens there in the year 2000. Um, can you give me like a 30,000 foot overview of how you got from that $90 lens there to where your business is at today with an assortment of lenses and people who are just creating really incredible pieces of art, really?
Absolutely. Yeah. So in 2002, I took a workshop from Kevin Kubota. So I'd been shooting with this lens for a year, and I'd shot far too much. If I look back, and I tend to do that, I'll get a new piece of equipment and I'll just obsess about it, and I'll shoot way more than I would end up over the long run, seeing a place for it in my photography. But I just started shooting everything. I'd go on fishing trips, fly fishing trips, and I'd take it and I'd shoot, you know, the scenes. I've got this photo of this huge beetle. I don't know how big it was, but you know, because it's touching the front element, you know, climbing over these pieces of straw, and a friend's puppy dog, you know, real close up, and you've got the center in focus, and it's all bent, and the colors are going crazy. And so a year and a half, or a little more than a year later, after getting that camera, I end up in a workshop with Kevin Kubota, his very first digital boot camp in Bend, Oregon. And I had the background of my computer. The desktop was one of these images, and then Kevin came over and asked, and I showed him a few others. And next thing I know, I'm you know, a couple months later, I've pretty much filled up his second workshop, because I told all my friends that this changed my life. And if you're considering digital, or you got your first digital camera and don't know what to do with it, you got to go to Kevin's workshop. So I filled up his second workshop. And then after the second workshop, Kevin called me and said, hey, would you teach with me at the third workshop and be a guest speaker? And I want you to teach about all this lens stuff you're doing. And I thought, I don't even know how to get another one of these. Like I'd gone on eBay and I'd bought a bunch, thinking that, oh, there's got to be a better wide angle converter that's going to do something even, you know, more amazing. And apparently I got the best one on that first trip. And
Score.
and so I didn't like, and still I didn't know even how to buy that one again. So what did I have to teach? I had in my mind, as with all of my over the years, and we haven't really covered this, over the years, I would make myself things that I either didn't want to pay for or weren't available. I made a 200-foot long, um, it was actually 50 feet, 25 feet, 100 feet, and, you know, probably a couple 25 footers of these cables that I would make and splice them into the Canon off-camera shoe cord distributors that would allow me to have multiple flashes on TTL, because there was no wireless TTL at the time.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I was doing that. I was going to Goodwill and I would find these huge Tupperware tops, and I would cut various shapes out of them, and I would double them over on my flash, and I'd let them go floppy on top, or I'd have, you know, it's basically the Gary Fong type experimentation that I was doing, but I was just doing them for myself. And I was able to get amazing light out of these things, but I wasn't thinking, hey, this is a product.
Hmm.
Um, and so for me to go from, this one lens to having something to teach, I had to pull on a lot of the ideas that I had had. One of them being modifying my Mamiya, or no, it was Bronica lenses to work as tilt shift lenses on my SLRs. There was only about maybe not even a half inch, probably closer to a quarter of an inch distance between the back of the lens and the front of the flange on my Canon SLRs. And then thinking about making a mechanism that would work there. But I had talked with an engineer about that, and he basically said, can't do it. And
Hmm.
like, okay, well, I guess those lenses 364 days a year just sit in the case. And then once a year or so, I would pull them out and use them for a particular client. And it's kind of wasted. And then I would go rent these tilt shift lenses. But all of these ideas were just sitting there. And when I got asked to teach the workshop, I looked at a speed graphic lens that was sitting, or a camera that my sister had given me for graduation from high school, that I think I'd shot one roll through, and it was full of light leaks and had all sorts of problems. And I was a photojournalist. I wasn't experimenting at that point. I wasn't even willing to go get a Diana camera and shoot a roll through that, because that was, that's what Krista did, and I don't want to open that Pandora's box.
Sure.
But I took those ideas that I had for modifying those medium format lenses, um, and this lens that, instead of an eighth of an inch or a quarter of an inch, um, between the front of the mount and the back of the lens, we now had like 2.5 inches. And I thought, well, now I just have to block out the light to see, so there's not stray light coming in, to see what the image is going to look like. Is it going to look like a tilt shift lens or a view camera when it's tilted? And so that was the very first prototype of the lenses that I was working on, or that I ended up bringing to the workshop. And I just brought a big thing. I brought a Dremel tool. I brought a drill. I brought a bunch of shop vac hose, because I had found that shop vac hose blocked out the light, and was cutting it to length, in my room at the resort that we were at in Central Oregon. And because I had to come up with enough for people to be able to beta test these things,
Hmm.
and there were like 25 people at the workshop. So that's where it started. That's the 20,000 feet of the beginning of something that was totally unique. But even then, it was based on lenses that I was getting off of eBay, or on Holga lenses, because Holga Mods was making pinholes out of Holga cameras, and so I would buy the lenses off the Holga Mods guy. And so yeah, it just kind of all came together through Kevin's invitation. And honestly, there was some anxiety, like, I don't really have anything to teach, I better come up with something brilliant.
Right.
And it ended up being Lens Baby.
Uh, So tell me today, like, if you could use like three words to describe what it is that you want Lens Baby to provide to photographers, what would that be? Was that even the right question to ask?
I don't know about three words, but I would say, if I were to get it down to three words, I'd say it's a reason to grow.
A reason to grow.
Because anytime we pick up something new that is fascinating to us, I think there's anxiety around that, because we're not good at it yet. We're just now exposed to something that's like, oh, this is different. Lens Baby's different than what my friends are doing. This is not largely accepted. Like, people may look at this and be critical. Um, but if I want to get from that initial point of, I don't know this is a new way of doing things, to the point where I'm like, hey, I'm kind of proud of that image I made, there's a learning curve in there, and there's
Hmm.
growth involved in that. And Lens Baby's mission statement is, we empower artists to move through fear to discover extraordinary freedom. And that fear, I think, has been present for me. And anything that is worth doing, that I didn't know how to do. And so that anxiety of looking at Krista's images and going, I can't do that. I want to do that. But there's this hurdle of it involves a lot of learning. It involves a feeling stupid. And so I held off until I had a digital camera before I really started embarking on that process. Um, but I think Lens Baby giving people a reason to grow is and learn is how I would distill what our purpose is.
I love that idea of pushing through the fear to, kind of get to this point to where you're able to create something that not only you're happy with, but also fulfills you. I think creatively is a very cool idea. Well, Craig, I gotta say, man, thank you so much for coming on today. I've taken up far too much of your time here. I know that we are well at the end of this, but before I let you go, I gotta ask. I know that people are wondering right now, where can we find out more about Lens Baby? Where can we find out more about Craig? So, where's the best place for listeners to do that?
So you can go to our online community on Instagram and go to Lens Baby USA at Lens Baby USA. And there's some really great communities on Facebook that you can learn and plug into. One of them is Lens Baby Unplugged, and I'm there most days. Another is, well, there's a whole bunch of others that are not, things that Lens Baby manages. Although I'm a part of some of those communities as well. So that's probably the best place, because I sense that you've got a following that really would resonate with plugging into a community and
Mm-hmm.
plugging into a place where it's not just a company saying, hey, this is what we do and come buy this thing. It's like, no, this is this is about people coming alongside each other and being excited for the learning process that can be, more rewarding in community. And so that's the biggest thing. And for me, my presence really these days is primarily through Lens Baby. So those are the places you can find me.
Beautiful. Well, Craig, again, man, thank you so much for coming on, sharing everything that you did. And I do look forward to keeping up with you and Lens Baby here in the future. I know you guys are going to come up with some great things.
Thanks, Raymond. We're working on it. No pressure, though.
Wow. My biggest takeaway from this episode is, if I had an idea and I made a prototype and people bought it and I sent it out and everyone returned it, I think anyone would feel devastated, to say the least, rightfully so. But Craig knew that, man, if these people, really gave it a chance, he knew that what he created would change their photography. So he kept with it until he got to, where he is today, where Lens Baby is today, with all the different lens options and optical effects. I think that is so cool. That persistence is something that really gets lost, I think, quite easy, because it's so much easier to just say, well, nobody liked it, and then just give up on something. But again, if you keep up and you refine it and you get better at something to get closer to your end goal, I think it's going to be really hard to actually fail. But it just takes that persistence. So I would love to hear what your biggest takeaway was from today's interview with Craig Strong. I would love to hear and have you share it in the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook community. You can search Facebook for Beginner Photography Podcast and find it. Or you can just head over to beginnerphotographypodcast.com, and there's a link right there on the homepage for you to join the group as well. So that is it for this week. Remember, the more that you shoot today, the better you will be tomorrow. Talk soon.
Thank you for listening to the Beginner Photography Podcast. If you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review in iTunes. Keep shooting, and we'll see you next week.